Welcome to Outside the Box with Jarv. I'm going to go ahead and get the clickbait out of the way. Yuri was actually right about a good many things, yet having a very specific perspective from the Soviets' perspective of espionage and covert and overt engagement, of active measures, he was able to lay out what had been happening then for years and what was to come, some 40 years ago. Yet, I do believe he gave an oversimplified version of ideological subversion that doesn't quite line up to what exactly has been happening throughout the West. It is good, however, a very good framework to build off of an accurate model of the fall of the West. His last step, normalization, is by the English definition of the word itself not something that would logically take place after a group of ideas had already infiltrated every level of society, to then become normalized over the last 7 to 8 decades. This is a modified and definitely more accurate diagram and timetable of the postmodernist and Marxist invasion of Western civilizations. I will now break down the validity and historical process of these 8 steps as they existed or are now being implemented in one specific country, the United States of America, and hopefully you can take from that and determine what has been going on and what is currently going on in your country. And if you live in the following countries, some form of postmodernist or Marxist invasion or process of deconstruction, make no mistake, has been going on and is continuing to go on, including but not limited to the United States of America, Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, Germany, France, Sweden, Norway, New Zealand, and India. And the 8 stages, as best as I have been able to work out, have broken down into the following. Introduction. Socialism and even systems similar to communism have existed before Karl Marx and Engels wrote the Communist Manifesto, yet the tendency to call such systems as communist or communistic are considered to have happened during the time of Marx, and likely have been inspired by the book he and Engels wrote, or at least the discussions and words of the two individuals and their arguments with capitalists. Either way, these concepts have been around since at least the late 1800s, and similar systems have possibly been in function in earlier less civilized groups of people, such as ancient tribes or nomadic or small groups of single religions. Yet the term Marxism refers to an umbrella collection of socialism, communism, and other systems that have similarities to these systems, and I would argue include a certain degree of the following systems: possibly some worker unions, communal living, National Socialism, and fascism. So we can accurately date the introduction of at least Marxism to the time period that Karl Marx and Engels lived, around the late 1800s. Now, postmodernism is harder to date, yet it is widely accepted to have emerged from France and other Western countries and moved over to the United States and the United Kingdom in the universities as a way of intellectual thought, or a way of interpreting the universe, and is believed to come into existence as far as the modern adaptation of such ideologies after or around the 1940s and later. There are many resources you can look into if you want to understand postmodernism that are available to you, but I'll go ahead and give you a few in the description to watch, and you can do your own research if you want to learn more. So, we can accurately date the introduction of postmodernism and the subsequent continuation of Marxism to roughly the center of the 20th century. And while not all Marxists are postmodernists, postmodernism came mostly from Marxists originally and includes the studies and continuation of Marxist ideologies and social political systems through postmodernism. The introduction of postmodernism and Marxism to the West Demoralization. The process of demoralization, as Yuri and others knew it as, and as we are beginning to understand it today, during the reawakening of the American mind, is a process of systematically challenging and then taking down or deconstructing the fundamentals of society and civilization, history and culture, ranging from rewriting history, creating an ever-increasing division of groups of victims, victors, oppressors, oppressed, racial, ethical, and sexual-based groups. Whether we like it or not, all of the following has contributed to, regardless of the good things they have brought, to the continual demoralization of Western culture and Western civilization. All four waves of feminism. While women being considered the equal of man in an intrinsic and fundamental sense is not only logical and is preferred by most of the West, it is arguably more ethical, and the following incarnations of feminism after the first wave in the 1920s and the next in the middle of the century only continued the separation of the sexes, or more like helped the re-separation of the sexes and the systematic breaking down of biologically and socially based gender roles and the perception of the sexes in society, as well as the scientifically based facts or supposed truths of sexes and races, and the many different genetic differences of humanity. While the social revolution of the 1960s gave way to allow the United States to fully and truly be one united people, with people being judged less and less by their genetics and more by their character and hopefully actions, the movements that followed this movement, such as the following democratically led policies and social changes of the 1970s and 80s and beyond, have successfully reignited the widening of the gap and continue to further widen the gap of the races and the sexes, and successfully almost completely undo the great process of the social and civil revolution of the 1960s. The great progress of the social and civil revolution of the 1960s, and one could easily argue operated in parallel with the inspiration of the postmodernist movement. Yuri gave us 6 different things that are attacked during the process of demoralization. Yet, I would argue there are at least 8. Religions, education, government and politics. You can see this most clearly with the Democratic Party. Businesses and employer-employee relations, such as with Yuri's examples of worker unions. Society, entertainment, and news, so-called media, and law and order. Normalization. During the mid-1900s and the late 1960s, the concepts and foundations of modernism, such as, but not limited to, objectivity and objective truths, science, math, reason, logic, and the current understanding of how human beings function and the universe at large, were challenged by the postmodernists and moved to other professors and philosophers, and spread to teachers and others who would then hold positions of power in the universities, and subsequently were taught these new postmodernist ideas to the following 4 generations of Americans: Boomers, Xers, Millennials, Ys, and are now being taught to the newest generation, Gen Z. Postmodernism has been fully accepted and embraced by the following 4 sectors of Western countries: governance and politics, news media, education, and entertainment. And of course, I got the number wrong, for there are many other elements that have been taken over by postmodernist ideologists, such as business and corporations, and especially the many Western small to large tech companies. This process of overtaking has been during the entire process of the following steps of demoralization, normalization, and destabilization. In addition, during the normalization phase, there has been a continual normalization of both the more secret core principles and functioning ideological branches of postmodernism and the active elements of postmodernism during the stage of normalization, all the way through the stages of destabilization and crisis. If you are wondering how or what has been normalized, just consider the different arms of the postmodernist movement and look into how these elements affect your life, the life of others in the West, and the validity or lack thereof of them becoming mainstream. Intersectionalism, which is the continual segregation of people based on perceived social value, race, and level of oppression or oppressor status. Identity politics, which is the splitting of people into groups such as, but not limited to, a specific group of race, class, or perceived gender or sexual orientation. Third and fourth wave feminism. Third wave feminism is an emphasis on women being able to do anything a man can do regardless of biological differences, or at least an end to women being paid less, even though they have different jobs, or the incorrect perception that they are paid less for the same jobs. Among other things, this branch leads to fourth wave feminism, and while ideas of toxic masculinity originated in third wave feminism, it is more an active measure of the fourth wave of feminism to start implementing counter-masculine measures in schools or society, and you could describe the difference between the two with such an example as, a third wave feminist says, men are toxic in their masculinity due to society and the assumptions and pressures and necessities of the past. While a fourth wave feminist might have a statement on their social media profile, such as, kill all men! Social justice, which is the activism of or against perceived social injustices, often at the expense of actual or legal justice. All forms of Marxism, a focus on the human effect on the environment with the ignoring of the natural heating and changing of Earth's climate over the many thousands of years, in studies such as environmentalism and climate change supposed sciences. A continual natural separation based on natural tribalism, yet with an emphasis on race or class instead of diversity of thought. Supposed body positivity and sex worker normalization, meant to normalize either the scientifically unhealthy or socially undesirability of ever-growing fringe groups of people. An overemphasis of pride or LGBTQ++Z, etc. Awareness of inclusivity, even though the majority of residents of Western countries have no significant problem with people having sexual interactions with other people, or basically just being themselves, so long as they don't negatively affect or interfere with others. The creation of diversity, equity, and inclusion offices, usually run either by Caucasian man or a light-skinned female, in an attempt not so much to have those ideas implemented so much as the greater introduction and subsequent acceptance of general postmodernist thinking. The ever-growing push for equality of equity, as opposed to the current level of supposedly equality, which boils ultimately down to a debate of equality of opportunity versus equality of outcome. More and more pushing of the ideas of the West of being inherently evil and thus needing an overthrow or complete change of power structure, with complete disregard to the many successes and accomplishments of the Western countries, many of which are limited to only the West, or countries that follow the Western systems, some of which are the following: ending slavery, women's suffrage, equality of opportunity, legal rights or laws protecting people by race, class, gender, sexual orientation, and other characteristics, and the right to speak or communicate so long as it does not call into specific violence or generalized direct violence. And the final example exists only in one country as far as I know, legally and written into the very foundation of the government, in the Constitution of the United States of America. It is also these countries and these groups of people that foresaw the ultimate intersectional of all human beings, the individual, and focused on giving the individual human rights over the many intersectional groups that could create a bizarre and hilariously vomit-inducing Venn diagram of the entire human species. And of course, my very favorite, censorship of speech by governments and large tech companies by arbitrarily assigning any unwanted speech as hate speech. The process of normalization across the West is already mostly complete. Destabilization is the process of destabilizing a country by making its military, government, production, economy, foreign relations, and defense systems less capable, and even incapable of functioning properly or accomplishing their essential functions. I will give you two examples of destabilization of at least the United States of America, if not also other countries, and I challenge you to find other elements of destabilization of the West and put them in the comments below. Even though the Democratic Party is and has always been the party of the KKK, pro-slavery movements, such as the revolution of the Civil War in America, and the systematic subservience of minorities to the supposedly liberal white leadership class, it also once supposedly stood for democracy, and now it clearly is attempting to represent the ever-increasing distancing of the perceived left, migration of postmodernists and Marxists, and the clearly insane movement of the left to defund, otherwise constrict or end the system of law and order, colloquially called the police. These movements, in accordance and in continual increasing support by the indoctrinated educators, entertainers, and people in power, and the forces in the establishment of media, government, education, and corporations, for the following movements have successfully move at least the United States of America to the next phase. Destabilization in the West is mostly complete. We are now in the second to final stage, before revolution. We are in the stage of crisis. With the movements of BLM, Antifa, and others in support by those mentioned in the previous section, the leaders of near the entirety of those who have power of voice and money in education, government, entertainment, news media, and other establishments. The United States, having successfully been demoralized for 80 years, normalized for over 70, and successfully destabilized by an ever-growing opposition to the very nature of order, and an over-exaggerated and over-politicized biological enemy, and the ever-increasingly idiotic legal measures of democratically elected and Democratic Party leaders to rip freedoms from the individuals and the individual, and continually release convicted felons and lower the statutes of crime during the pandemic, allowing virtually all theft below $1,000 to be essentially below the $1,000 threshold to be essentially without legal consequence. All as if obvious preparation for the following chaos. Crisis. From the Merriam-Webster Dictionary. The turning point for better or worse in an acute disease or fever. A paroxysmal attack of pain, distress, or disordered function. The decisive moment, as in a literary plot. An unstable or crucial time or state of affairs in which a decisive change is impending, one with the distinct possibility of a highly undesirable outcome. A situation that has reached a critical phase. If you are aware of the social political situation in the United States and other countries of the West, you can easily see that we are clearly in this stage. The phase before revolution. And the next phase is revolution, followed by aftermath. The stage of aftermath. It is important to note that there are countries that exist that have already passed through these phases or stages of active measures, crisis, and the next phase is revolution, then followed by aftermath. It is important to note that there are countries that exist that have already passed through these stages of active measures brought upon them by Marxists instead of postmodernists, such as Communist China, that ended up having to fall back on state-run capitalism to re-enable growth in their nation, ex-USSR Russia, Venezuela, Cuba, and even Italy and Germany, possibly during the period in between the two world wars. Now more than ever is the time to use your voice and speak up against active measures of the Now more than ever is the time to use your voice and speak up against the active measures of the postmodernists and the systematic destruction of Western civilization, Western culture, society, and people who love their individuality. Share this video, like, comment, and prepare yourself mentally and in other ways for the inevitable culmination and final stages, revolution and aftermath. There are clearly at least two sides to this struggle for power and the destruction of capitalism, democracy, culture, religion, and society. The so-called woke postmodernists and the awakened few who would dare stand in defiance of this abomination of society and civilization and defend the West from its destruction. You cannot ultimately be apolitical. If you wait too long, a side will be chosen for you, and it may not be the one you prefer or can live with. And of course, I do not call for violence. Instead, use all peaceful and anti-violent measures to fight the enemy. And stand up, defend, live free. Know your 5 intrinsic human rights, evidenced by your capability to use them, the ability to speak, believe, think, act, and live as you will. Thanks for watching.